These are Nebraska corn farmers. They work in acres, not hours, harvesting the energy and climate solutions the world needs. We are proud to stand with you.
The success of tomorrow's soy industry depends on the actions we take today. The future is here, and the time to move is now.
Market Journal Television for Agricultural Business Decisions is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources in partnership with the Nebraska Rural Radio Association. Promotional support provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine and partial funding provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
Hello everyone, I'm Alex Makovica. Thanks for joining us this week on Market Journal. Coming up today, we've got the latest information on corn and soybean diseases you'll want to be on the lookout for this growing season. Plus updates on what's been a wild ride in the cattle markets from this year's cattle convention and NCBA trade show that's happening down in San Antonio this week. And of course, Eric Hunt standing by as always with this week's forecast. But we'll start off here. The Farmers and Ranchers College continues to offer high-quality programming to area producers and ag business professionals for the 2024-25 season. The final program of the season coming up very soon. Considering some of the devastation farmers had to endure with a string of hailstorms last summer, the Farmers and Ranchers College will conclude with a comprehensive session covering crop revenue management and a weather outlook on 2025.
Yep, so we are ready to have our last Farmers and Ranchers College program. It'll be held February 21st in Geneva at our fairgrounds. And it's featuring Steve Johnson, who is a retired ag economist. He's done a lot of work with crop insurance, and he'll explain some crop marketing strategies and also just kind of helping put together marketing plans as well. And then after he presents, we'll have Dr. Eric Snodgrass. He's an atmospheric meteorologist with Conduit, and he does a really amazing job of explaining weather trends. He's done a lot of research with different computer software and just kind of explaining the outlook for 2025.
Beyond educating Nebraska producers, the event is also open for high school and college students. Even if they're not currently working on a farm or ranch, events like this are still a great learning experience for students in the state.
Yeah, so trying to teach the high school students that even when they get out of high school, they're still going to be learning all of the time. And some of the youth that have attended other programs have really gotten a lot out of it, and it's helped them know more about extension and get to know more about what it takes to be a farmer. And it's not necessarily just running the machinery, it's making all of those important business decisions. And so trying to learn a little bit more about what it is that they'll have to know in the future.
To recap, the event will be held on Friday, February 21st, with registration set to begin at 8:30 and the program kicking off shortly after at 8:45. The event is free to attend and, as you heard earlier, is open to both high school and college students who are interested in attending. Pre-registration is not required but greatly appreciated. And if you'd like to pre-register for the event, you can call the Fillmore County Extension Office or visit go.unl.edu/frcollege. That information now at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be sure to make it available along with this story on the Market Journal website. Well, last week we brought you some information on adopting in-season nitrogen management systems from this year's Eastern Nebraska Corn and Soybean Expo in Fremont. Another topic at that event was corn disease. Market Journal's Bill Dodd had the chance to catch up with extension plant pathologist Tamra Jackson Ziems to see what she's watching for the 2025 growing season.
The other thing you might not think about is the temperature.
A lot of people had more corn diseases this past year in 2024 than what we've seen in recent years. In recent history, actually, we had an outbreak of southern rust that probably hasn't been rivaled since what we saw way back in 2006. And so we saw a lot of southern rust move into Nebraska early, and it became widespread really early by the middle of July. And so we made sure people knew about that. And in some places it did become pretty severe. Some things that we need to keep in mind about southern rust is the good news is it will not overwinter. And so just because someone may have had a lot of southern rust in 2024 does not mean that they will have it again in 25 or even beyond that, because that one needs to blow in every year from southern locations. Unfortunately, though, a lot of people also did see more tar spot this year, especially under pivot irrigation, and we're beginning to understand more about that. It's no surprise that the disease is worse under pivot irrigation because that fungus needs moisture, and especially keeping the leaves wetter longer is going to promote more disease. And so we do that when we irrigate. And so we recommend people watch those fields, especially in the easternmost parts of Nebraska. The disease has made it out about halfway across the state now, but in the easternmost counties, that's where we've seen it now for about 3 years, and we've had a buildup of that fungus over time, and we're starting to see more serious disease in some of those areas, not all of them though. And so it's worth watching for. It's worth selecting hybrids, working with your seed company to get hybrids that might perform better or have a little bit more resistance to that disease. And it would help keep disease severity lower if you've got that as an option for you. And it might help prevent one or more fungicide applications later on down the road. However, if people do need to resort to a foliar fungicide, we do have options that work very well. And so some of the commercially available products, the combination products that have 2 or 3 modes of action in them, tend to be the ones that do the best job controlling tar spot. It then becomes a question of when do we make those applications. And so we, looking at some of our counterparts data, like from Purdue University and from around the Midwest, we know that applications made between about tasseling up to early dough might provide the best control most years for tar spot, but we really do have to watch disease when it develops and how severe it's becoming. And so we do have some options there. And so hopefully not many of our producers will need that in the future, because the bad news about tar spot is that this fungus does actually overwinter. And we still are learning a lot about tar spot. There's a lot of questions we have that are unanswered. Unfortunately, in other states, they're not seeing benefits for crop rotation and tillage for managing tar spot. And so that's something that we will have to learn more about, but might be some potential bad news. And so if you've had tar spot in your area, it will redevelop when conditions are right, and especially under irrigation. So a few more things that we're also recommending that people watch out for. In 2024, there was another disease reported in several other states to our south, and that disease is corn stunt. And we did have some samples test positive in Nebraska. Corn stunt is caused by one of several different pathogens. The most common one is the spiroplasma, and that's what we tested positive for this past year. This disease can cause plant leaves to turn red or purple. And so they might be easy to see, but unfortunately there's a lot of things that cause corn plant leaves to turn reddish purple, and it might be confusing for people. And so we will continue to monitor for this disease. The pathogen is vectored by the corn leaf hopper, which was also reported for the first time in Nebraska this year. And also that and the corn stunt spiroplasma in, I think, 10 new states this past year. And so we have colleagues that we're working with to monitor for the pathogen and testing samples this coming year. So if they have, any of our viewers have any questions or want samples tested, please reach out to the Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic on East Campus or in Nebraska Extension, and you can find more information at both cropwatch.unl.edu and on the Crop Protection Network.
Thanks for that, Bill. You can learn more about these corn diseases and other general advice when it comes to caring for your crops by visiting cropwatch.unl.edu. It is now time to turn our attention over to the markets. This week we have a special report from Rural Radio Network's Rebel Seclocha. She's down at this year's cattle convention and NCBA trade show taking place in San Antonio.
We're here at the 2025 edition of Cattle Industry Convention here in San Antonio, and joining me now is Shaylee Stewart, livestock market analyst with DTN. Shaylee, there's a lot of excitement up and down the halls with the beef markets as they are, but give us an overview. I know the last week there's been a lot of different highs and lows. What has been impacting that?
You know, really, Rebel, there's been so many things that have came to play. We've had a historic market week after week after week. As we've been early trudging through 2025, the market has eclipsed and reached new highs week in and week out. Whether you look at the feeder cattle complex or the fed cattle market, we've seen record-breaking highs. But this past week, the market has been troubled a little bit because of a few onsets of news headlines over the weekend, whether it be conversations regarding tariffs or the announcement that Mexican feeder cattle, or I should say cattle in general, imports out of Mexico will resume any day now. There's been challenges to the marketplace. And so, yes, that has obviously pressured the complex to some degree, and there's been a little bit of a hurdle, a little bit of a setback, but really the underpinnings of the market are still very strong, very bullish, and cattle producers are most likely going to continue to see a fruitful 2025, most likely well into 2026 as well.
Absolutely. Well, breaking down those factors just a little bit further, with cattle imports resuming from Mexico, what will that factor in particular, how will that play out for producers?
You know, really that's a question that's going to revolve so much around timing, because we know that the USDA and APHIS agree that the imports are going to start any day now, but there's a couple factors that we don't know. We don't know exactly what day in which the cattle are going to begin imported again into the United States, and we don't know the timing of that degree. So we've had the last 2 months in which cattle imports out of Mexico have completely been halted because of the New World Screwer. But we don't know if those cattle are going to be trickled into the market in a meticulous, really just kind of slow, mundane pace, or if they're going to show up all at once. Obviously, if the cattle show up all at once, we're going to most likely see pressure in the feeder cattle side of things. But if they're trickled into the complex in a timely, methodical nature, the pressure won't likely be assumed, and they're going to be well received by buyers because we simply don't have the supplies in which they need to keep up with demand.
Absolutely. Well, tariffs have been the big bad word over the last few months, but how could the threat of tariffs or tariffs, if implemented, impact the cattle market?
You know, tariffs are a big thing because we rely heavily on demand from both Canada and Mexico. Thankfully, from the beef side of things, we've already seen Trudeau come out and say that beef will not be one of the things that he intends to tariff. And thankfully, President Trump has been able to communicate with Mexico's president as well. And as they're our biggest market for the lean hog imports from the United States into Mexico, that market is very essential. And so thankfully here on Wednesday today, we've already seen the cattle complex and the lean hog market find stability and security in the marketplace because of the development. So one thing that I think that we need to remember is that the markets are people, and people like to react emotionally. And so even though we might see headlines pop out and news break out, and we might see these markets be challenged for a day or two, and they do have challenges that are underpinning to the marketplace, we need to also remember that these are tactics in trade and negotiation. And so even though we might see one day of hardship or one day in where prices are pressured, overall, we need to remember the grand scheme of things, and that even bullish markets have weaker days. And so we need to keep a long-term perspective in check and remind ourselves that just because the market trades lower on a daily basis or for a day's basis, that doesn't mean that we're seeing a shift in the market as a whole.
Certainly. Well, morale is high in the hallways with producers from across the country gathering and many of them just selling their calf crop for the year. But as you mentioned, that emotional component, what kind of mindset should producers have as they look towards 2025 and beyond?
I'm really glad that you asked that question because so many people like to correlate the 2025 cattle market to that of what we saw in 2014 and 2015 because we like to relate things back to history, right? But this market is much different than what we saw in 2014 and 2015. I do not believe our build back is going to be as rapid or the same as what we saw in 2014 and 2015. And there are still a lot of challenges that cattlemen are faced with today. Obviously, interest rates are still really expensive. Input costs are still really high. We have drought as a lingering factor in the marketplace. So while prices are high and very lucrative to producers on the grassroots level, they're being very cautious. We just had the cattle inventory report come out last week, and we did not see, whether you looked at the beef cow inventory from a mature herd standpoint or you looked at the retention of beef replacement females, we have not yet seen any indication that growth has begun to resume. And so I really think that producers are being keen and waiting because they need to see more reassurance in the marketplace that they're going to continue to see that money trickle down into the grassroots level. So I really believe that the optimism, the enthusiasm, the excitement is going to continue well through 2025 into 2026 because of the two factors of supply and demand. We have a limited supply thankfully, we have exuberant demand, strong demand from both consumers here domestically and abroad. And so the market should continue to be robust.
Absolutely. Well, there's so many wonderful sessions that producers can attend here at CattleCon and get a wealth of information. But you obviously have the cattle producer standpoint and then also, the market analyst side of things as well. What are some things that you have taken from CattleCon this year that you'd like people at home who are probably somewhere much, much cooler, maybe breaking ice, not at CattleCon? What would you like them to know?
Really, I want them to know that this is their marketplace and that they are empowered to make the decisions they need to make. And so I think that you brought up a really good question earlier. We did see some pressure in the complex earlier this week, but yet we're still talking about a bullish market. And so what I would like to encourage producers is to remember that you are in the driver's seat of your market and that there are ways that you can mitigate some risk and that your cattle are an asset until the day in which you liquidate them and sell them. And so if you're feeling pressured, if you're feeling anguish about the market and it's just simply something that's too overwhelming, remember that the market is people. The cattle market, the greater market as a whole, are comprised of people, and people are emotional. And so if things start to run too fast, trade too fast, and things get overwhelming, sometimes it's better if we just step back for a second, relook at the market from a 10,000-foot view, and decide to really just reanalyze where things sit. And like I said earlier, your cattle are an asset until the point in which you liquidate them. And so I just encourage producers to remember that and think about that moving forward if things start to get a little bit fast-paced.
A very special thanks to Rebel for her work down in Texas this week. And next week, we'll be joined by longtime Market Journal contributor Darren Newsom. So if you have a question you'd like for us to ask Darren, just email us or get in touch on social media, and we'll be sure to pass those questions along. Landon Drews is a Paxton FFA chapter officer and a high school sophomore. He wanted to develop a dryland corn test plot on land owned by the school district. So with the help from his FFA advisor, parents, family members, and the local school board, Drews not only organized a test plot, he established a community harvest day last October, hosting students from the local school and community members in an educational event around harvesting at the test plot. Get all the details about Landon's story in the February issue of Nebraska Farmer. Time now for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Eric Hunt. And Eric, it has been a mixed bag of weather over the last several days, the last couple of weeks. What is to come in the week ahead?
Thanks, Alex. Watching the potential for some snow and some much colder temperatures across the state this week. Complements to this pattern, which is a huge ridge over Alaska and a strong trough getting down here in the western United States. So this is basically direct access to Arctic air coming into the north central portion of the country. We're also going to have a couple different shortwaves moving into the central U.S. For the Intermountain West between Monday and Wednesday. That's going to bring a couple different chances of snowfall starting Monday night through Wednesday morning or maybe even Wednesday afternoon across the state. With best chances of 3 inches of snow, the western portion of Sandhills down toward the southern border with Kansas and south central and southeastern Nebraska. Lowest chances of picking up 3 inches of snow here across the northeastern portion of the state. But I do think everybody has a reasonable probability of picking up 1 inch of snow through the first half of next week. In terms of liquid water equivalent, not going to be much of a water maker, maybe about 1/10 of an inch of liquid water equivalent for most of us. Better chance of picking up 1/4 of an inch as we get closer to the Kansas border. It will be cold, though, most of this next week, particularly starting on Monday afternoon across portions of north central and northwestern Nebraska. That colder air will be spreading toward the south and the east. And I imagine Tuesday and Wednesday we'll see highs in the teens statewide. And I would guess there's probably going to be a probability of temperatures not even breaking 10 degrees across portions of north central and northeastern Nebraska on Wednesday afternoon as well. I do think everybody will have at least 1 or 2 nights with a chance of getting below zero, particularly if we have some snow cover with relatively light winds. Wind speeds are likely to be a little bit elevated across central and eastern portions of Nebraska on Tuesday with that snowfall, so just something to be watched out for to be sure if you happen to be out traveling that day. CPC does show a risk of hazard temperatures coming in next week, and so I think there's going to be another chance of a big shot at Arctic air later this next week after a little bit of moderation on Thursday and Friday. CPC is in agreement with this, with themselves, I guess, in this case, keeping temperatures below average through the first portion of the week after next. Not necessarily showing a strong signal for precipitation for most of the state. A little bit of chance for more snowfall across portions of western Nebraska. But some of the models are indicating another storm system moving into the central U.S. late next week and early the week after that would potentially bring some more snowfall for portions of central and eastern Nebraska, particularly eastern Nebraska and further east into Iowa and Illinois and Wisconsin. In terms of precipitation, recently we did have a good bit of precipitation across portions of southeastern Nebraska, with lighter amounts getting out here into south central portions of the state. We did see a little bit of improvement on the drought monitor here across Pawnee County, but for most of us this remains the same as it's been for the last several weeks. In terms of dryness, it's been very, very dry here across this entire region, south central and central Nebraska, going back to the week before Thanksgiving, some of the driest on record for the common period of record. And I just want to point out, next Friday morning at 9 o'clock Central, 8 o'clock Mountain Time, I'll be doing a special joint webinar with Eric Snodgrass at Conduit Ag. You can register at www.ag-wx.com/webinar. Again, next Friday at 9 o'clock Central, 8 o'clock Mountain Time, we'll be talking about the outlook for this coming growing season. Hope you all can attend that. And here's a temperature precipitation roundup for the week ending February 1st, 2025. That 41 in Scottsbluff, that is the warmest temperature ever for minimum low temperature in early February. Back to you, Alex.
All right, thanks, Eric. And finally, today we're taking a look back at the 2024 growing season and looking ahead to what's to come for 2025 for soybean producers this week for our Crop Talk segment. Earlier this week, Market Journal's Mike Straub caught up with Extension plant pathologist Dylan Manchel to learn what diseases soybean producers should be watching for this year.
With planting season quickly emerging, considering last season's soybean diseases and preparing for this year's crops, disease management and soil testing should be top priority in hopes of avoiding yield loss due to disease this year.
So for soybean production in 2024, we sort of had the standard big challenges like sudden death syndrome and soybean cyst nematode. A lot of growers had questions about those and how they can deal with those and manage those. And they're also thinking about soil testing this time of year. They can still get that done. So the Nebraska Soybean Board is still supporting free soil testing for any Nebraska grower to see if they have soybean cyst nematode in their fields. It's important to figure out if you have soybean cyst nematode in the field, but it's also important to follow up and test again to make sure that management is working. Unfortunately, this parasite can cause significant yield loss with no noticeable symptoms. So monitoring those population levels is the only way you can really tell how well it's being managed. As we gear up for planting season, a lot of growers probably decided on their varieties already, but there might be some leeway in there. So just take another chance, look back at those field histories and make sure that the varieties you've placed in those fields, they've got good tolerance and resistance ratings for the diseases that you've had in those fields in the past. Specific diseases, think about soybean cyst nematode. That's an important one when it comes to resistance genes. So select something that has PI88788 as a resistance source, or a new one called peaking that's done quite well. Another big problem in the past that these upcoming fields are going to have might be white mold. So if you had white mold bad in 2023, pick a variety with good resistance for white mold.
When thinking about white mold, it's beneficial to know that it will overwinter in cornfields and show up again in soybeans after rotation. Over-irrigation can also be a main cause of white mold in soybeans.
It not only overwinters, but it'll last several years. So we had bad white mold in Nebraska in 2021 and again in 2023. So if you think about it, those are the same fields if you're on a corn-soybean rotation. They were bad, they rotated to corn, that's not a host, and then back to beans. The problem is, in 2024, we were corn again, and in 2025, we're going to rotate back to beans on those fields. So the inoculum is still there, especially if you've had it bad in both of those years. That inoculum that's going to start that infection is still there, so think about that coming up. And try to get ahead on making some of those fungicide decisions. I'd say the biggest predictor for if you're going to deal with white mold again is if you had it those last two cycles that you had soybeans in those fields. So think about those fields as where you want to focus your management when it comes to white mold. Especially for white mold, a big driver is irrigation. So the first places I saw it this year were soybean fields or soybean borders around seed corn fields. The reason it's showing up there is because that's a perfect example of over-irrigation on those beans, because the corn is what really needs it and what's driving those decisions. But think about that as an example. When you get excessive irrigation on soybeans, that's when white mold's really going to flare up. That could be in weird cases like soybean borders, but also in your own full soybean fields. Think about making sure you're not over-irrigating, and think about putting that water on when it's needed. So not too early. Not too early if your soils can hold it. The same thing that Tamra Jackson Ziems stated, though, about disease pressure being potentially worse in the middle of that center pivot. That could work out as well in soybean production, the pivot's just moving slower, putting out water slower in the center than it is at the faster moving tip of that pivot. So you're going to have leaves stay wetter longer in that center. So when you think about scouting, maybe follow that pivot row down and try scouting the middle of that field.
If heavy rain or several days of overcast skies are in the forecast, getting ahead of that weather pattern with foliar fungicide applications will be beneficial in combating white mold in soybeans.
So you're more dependent on the environment. Think about weather patterns when you're going to get that rain. For white mold specifically, the plant is most susceptible during the peak of that flowering, during the peak of that soybean flowering. So if you've got strong weather patterns coming through that are going to leave overcast skies, a lot of rain for several days, think about, if the plants are susceptible, making those foliar fungicide applications leading into an event like that, just so you can get ahead of it. So when you're getting into the growing season and you start to see some issues, the first thing you really got to do is make sure you've taken the time to identify what disease you're dealing with specifically. Management is always going to be disease specific, and in some cases you can make management decisions in the season, like foliar fungi. You might be able to get out there and put on a foliar fungicide quickly. But in a lot of cases, especially when it comes to seedling diseases like we might see early in the spring, making good notes, figuring out where those pathogens are in your field, it's not going to save you this season, but next time you rotate around, you can place appropriate seed treatments in those areas. Just get ready for the spring. Think about those seedling diseases as we get into that early season. Scout for those and then figure out which seedling diseases you're dealing with, because they're actually quite different. Even though a lot of the symptoms look the same, it might impact your seed treatment management decisions in the future.
Disease management is always going to be disease specific. Scouting and identifying seedling diseases will help with seed management decisions in the future. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Mike Straub.
All right, thanks, Mike. If you'd like to learn about soybean diseases and mitigation tactics, you can find everything you'll want to know. A great resource is cropwatch.unl.edu. That is going to do it for this week's show. If you missed a story or want to catch up, be sure to follow along with Market Journal on YouTube and social media to join in on the conversation. Until then, hope to see you right back here next week. I'm Alex Makovica. Hope you have a good weekend.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.